The next sample we're going to look at is the 3-point dart or plain darts sample. Do note that this pattern comes in 2 pieces. The full pattern will not print on a single piece of paper, so it prints on 2 pieces. And just as it states on the pattern, match this grain line to combine printed patterns. So you need to overlay this grain line with the other in order to make this pattern the correct size. So they will overlap each other. Use a light table, a bright window, or a light colored table surface so you can see through both layers of paper and match up these 2 lines with the arrow points on either side. So make sure those are layered, overlapped on top of one another. These lines on the bottom should match up. These lines along the top should match up, so it creates one full pattern. Once these are properly aligned, you can tape, staple, glue these 2 pieces of paper together, whatever you need to do to combine these 2 pages into one. Once that is done, you can then lay down a piece of ironed muslin fabric, place your combined pattern on top, pin it in place, and then cut your pattern out. Be sure to watch the video for how to copy patterns, how to transfer your pattern information, because we have notches, 4 notches at the top here. Be sure to cut those notches. We also have 6 tailor's tacks, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Be sure you are copying these tailor's tacks using a hand needle and some thread. So once you have the entire pattern cut, the tailor's tacks sewn, the notches clipped, you can see I've got my muslin underneath here, you can remove the pattern. And just as stated in the video, when you're pulling these patterns away from your tailor's tacks, just be very careful. Be sure to hold the pattern, the muslin down, hold down your tailor's tacks. My tailor's tacks have been sewn with 1 stitch. I've just gone in and out with my needle 1 time, so my tailor's tacks are going to slide right out. If you sew it twice, as I showed in the previous video, where you go in and out through your tailor's tacks 2 times, make sure to hold your tailor's tacks and then pull your pattern paper so that it rips through your pattern paper. Your tailor's tacks will rip through your pattern paper. So just be slow, be patient with removing the pattern. Once you have this done and you've got your fabric cut and your tailor's tacks removed from the pattern paper, take a photo of your work so that I can see that you did apply your 6 tailor's tacks. Now, when we have all of our notches clipped and our tailor's tacks sewn in there, we can use these marks to identify where our dart legs are. So if you're unfamiliar with darts, let's get a little bit of a primer for some of the terminology used with darts. These lines that form a V shape are referred to as the dart legs. This point where the 2 legs converge are the dart points. So this would be 1 dart point and the 2nd dart point. You always notch where your dart legs end at the edge of your pattern piece, and you always mark where your dart points are, so you know how to connect the notch to this point to create 1 line on your pattern, and this other dart to this dart point, this other notch to this dart point to create the other line of your dart leg. So these key points, the notch, the 2nd notch, and the dart point, makes up the 3-point dart. 1, 2, and 3. Again, 1, 2, and 3 points. So we will sew the dart legs together. And darts are an awesome way, it's the very first method that you'll learn to create shape in your fabric. When we're working with fabrics, they're very 2-dimensional. And once we start sewing these V-shaped darts, or 3-point darts, into our fabric, you're going to start seeing some shape happen. And this is imperative to creating shape that goes over the body and the form. I'm going to mark where my darts are using my friction pen so I can see where each of these points are. So I've zoomed in on one of my darts and I'm just marking where each of my tailor's tacks are, right in the center of my little mark. You can also mark it on this side of your muslin. You can see where each of those points are. And I can now draw a line from my notch. Here's one of my notches. This is the leftmost notch. Here's the other notch here. I'm going to start over here on the leftmost side from my notch through this point all the way to my dart point. You need at least 2 points in order to draw a line. Joining one point to another will always give you a straight line. So there's one dart leg, and I'll move over here to my other notch, place my ruler right up against that notch, and align it through these 2 points all the way to my dart point, through that tailor's tack, and through my dart point. So now I've copied this dart, these dart legs, to my muslin. When you're working on final fabrics, fashion fabrics, you may or may not draw your dart legs. It depends on what kind of fabric you're using and what kind of finish you want. Sometimes these friction pens are not always the best option, and you may just use the tailor's tacks. You might keep the tailor's tacks in your sample on your fashion fabric. So I've marked these out. I've removed my tailor's tacks because now my dart is drawn on my muslin, and I'm going to scoot over to the other one and show you the same method. Here are my 3 points, 1, 2, and 3, where my tailor's tacks are. I'm going to make a mark inside each of these tailor's tacks. If it helps, you can also mark on the opposite side of your muslin. For sample purposes, that's perfectly fine. And now here's one of my notches up here, and the other one over here. I'm then going to align my ruler to one notch through the tailor's tack to the dart point and draw this dart leg. Do the same here from my notch through my tailor's tack to my dart point and draw my other dart leg. I can remove the tailor's tacks. Be sure you photograph your work before you remove your tailor's tacks so I know that you have done that. The tailor's tacks are a great way to mark internal points on your patterns, even if you are folding your fabric up and transporting it to other locations. Now, I'm going to pin my darts together. And to do so, because I've marked this side of my fabric, I will assume that this is the wrong side of my fabric. I wouldn't want to mark up the right side of my fabric, but this is a symmetrical pattern, so it doesn't matter which side you mark as long as you keep it consistent. I'm going to work with this dart first, and I'm going to pinch my fabric together. I'm pulling the fabric up towards me, and I'm going to fold my fabric. And I'm going to let the rest of this fabric tuck itself underneath, and I'm going to fold along my dart. What I'm looking to do is fold along this central line here. Now I haven't marked this on my fabric, but we can guess at where that center is. We know that center line will go down the middle of the dart here. This is called your dart peak, where these 2 lines meet at a little point right here. And that fold will go all the way through the dart point. So I know I'm going to have to fold along this dart point. Even if I'm not so sure of where my dart peak is, I know my folded fabric needs to go through my dart point. So again, lifting the fabric up towards me, folding it and tucking this fabric underneath. And here's my dart point. I'm going to make sure, because now I've got my fabric folded, but my dart point is not on my fold. I'm going to make sure, just kind of pivoting my fabric around to make sure that my dart point sits right on that fold. I'm going to go ahead and pin down here near my dart point because I don't want that fold to move. And just as I've done before, because I'll be inserting my fabric this way in the machine so I can easily remove my pins from the right hand side, I'm going to pin from right to left, as you can see on my setup here. Now at the top, I'm not exactly sure where my dart peak is, but I have my notches, which is exactly why we clipped those notches in the first place. I've got one notch here and another one sitting back here somewhere. I'm going to align those notches. I'm just going to shift my fabric until those two notches are aligned with one another. So both notches are right on top of each other. And again, I will pin across my stitching line. This is going to become my stitching line. But now I've got my notches aligned, I've got my dart point aligned on my fold. Now I want to make sure that this line that I've drawn, this dart leg, is as closely aligned to this dart leg as possible. Now, I'm not working with sheer fabrics or translucent fabrics, so how would I go about ensuring that this line is aligned to this line over here if I can't see through the fabric? I'm going to use my pins to my advantage. I'm going to put my pin down through this line. I've aligned it right on that dart leg line, and I'm going to bring it back up along that same line. This takes a little bit of patience. Again, I'm using my fingers underneath to support my pin so I can push the pin back out. And I think I can get a little bit closer here. Get it as close as I can to being on that dart leg line that I've drawn. There we go. So now my pin is kind of guiding where that dart leg line is that I've marked. I went down through both layers and back up through both layers. And if I turn this over, hopefully my pin will still be aligned to that dart leg. And if it's close, within about a 1/16 of an inch or so, then I know, I'm pretty confident that this line is aligned to this line. Now, let me show you what happens if for some reason the notches are not properly aligned or the fold is not properly aligned, and I go to pin through my dart leg from one side to the next. So I know my pin is aligned on this side, but if I turn it over, it is not aligned on the opposite side. So if I were to sew this dart with these dart legs not being aligned to one another, this dart would end up being much too big. It would be too wide. I'd be adding almost 1/4 of an inch of extra fabric into that dart, which would make the dart too big, hence making my garment too small. So if I were for some reason to look at this, say, uh-oh, there's something wrong here, I'd at least know that, okay, this pin is too far to the left of the line that's underneath. So I'd remove my pin, I would adjust the fold of my fabric and repin it and check it again to see if I'm anywhere close. Getting a little bit closer. It's about a 1/16 of an inch off. That's fairly close. Maybe one more little shift, shifting that fold one more time. Try it once more. It's a little bit better. It's full. It's fitting here, but not fitting here, and that's because I haven't properly pinned my notches together. You can see one notch is sitting here and the other sitting way over there, almost 1/4 of an inch off. So if you are aligning the notches properly and you've got your dart point sitting precisely on that fold of your fabric, these two dart legs should line up. But again, just to ensure, I will use my pin. And it's very important when you are testing this that you use straight pins. These pins over time will bend. If used too heavy-handed, they might bend, so make sure the pin you're using is nice and straight or else this won't work. Now, I don't want to leave this pin in this orientation because when I go to sew, I'm going to hit the tip of my pin and then I'm just going to have a mess on my hands on the sewing machine. But knowing that these lines are properly aligned from one side to the other, I'm now going to take a third pin and, just as I've done before, pin perpendicular to my stitching line. Knowing that my fabric is in the correct orientation, everything is aligned, I can now remove this pin and know that everything should line up properly from one side to the other. I'm going to do the same thing for this dart over here. Show you that one more time. Again, I'm pulling the fabric up towards me. I'm going to fold my fabric, ensuring that my dart point is right on that fold. And I'll pin down here at this dart point through both layers. And then up here, I'm going to align my notches. Make sure those are lined up. Pin together up here, across perpendicular to my stitching line, which is what's about to become my stitching line through both layers. I'll check to make sure that both dart legs, put a little bit of a finger press in here, just press it with my fingers to make sure that fold is set in there. Go down using my fingers to support the pin underneath and push back up along my dart leg. So I know this pin is aligned to this dart leg that I've marked. I'm going to turn it over and see how it looks over there. Pretty close. It's a little bit off, about a 1/16 of an inch off. So I'm going to remove that, and I'm just going to shift my fabric. If you go to shift your fold and you pin it again and it goes even further off, then you've shifted the fold in the wrong direction. Just shift it back. So you'll see as I'm shifting, I'm rolling the fabric in one direction or the other. I'm using my fingers to roll the fabric. So I'll show you really briefly. If I have a straight line here, just for demonstration purposes, and I'm folded right along that line, I'll either roll my fabric in one direction, there's the line that shifted in that direction, or I will roll it back. You can see the line shifts in that direction. So if it's not clear how I'm shifting that fold, I'm just rolling my fabric in one direction or the other. That's looking much better, much closer to the line. And again, I don't want to sew with my pin going in this orientation, so I'll take one more pin down and back up through all layers perpendicular to my stitching line, and then I can remove this. This pin going through the dart legs is just to ensure that my dart legs are matching on both sides. Okay. And again, you'll notice that I've pinned everything so I can keep all my excess fabric to my left on the sewing machine, and I've got my pin heads on my right so I can easily remove those as I'm sewing. Same thing here. I'll end up pushing all my extra fabric over here with all the excess to my left and my pin heads on my right so I can easily remove those. Now let's head to the sewing machine. If it's been a moment since you've used the machine, be sure to test your stitches on a scrap piece of fabric. Ensure that you are sewing at a number 2 stitch. If you need to adjust this, remember to push down the reverse lever halfway and then you can adjust the stitch length. I'm going to place my work in the machine with the notches first. We always start our 3-point darts from the widest point of the dart. We start all of our darts from the widest point of the dart and travel to the narrowest point where the dart point is. We're going to start here at the ends of the dart legs, lifting my presser foot, placing my work underneath, lowering my foot, and then I will start taking some stitches. As soon as I start stitching through fabric and I've gone past the notches, I will take 2 stitches forward, 2 stitches back. There's my back tack. And then stitch along my dart leg. I'm going to use my line as a guide and stitch along that line. Be as precise as possible, removing my pins as I go. And as I near the dart point, you can see I'm getting close to the dart point. It's very important when you're sewing these darts that you stitch off of this folded edge of your fabric as close to this dart point as possible. Don't stitch off too high, don't stitch off too low, or it will change the length of your dart. I'm just going to continue on going all the way through my dart point, which is marked right here. And once I get past this dart point, I'm going to continue stitching on the machine, similar to how we sew on a serger. I'm going to keep stitching, I'm going to hold onto my fabric and pull that away. So I will be stitching off of the fabric. Just going to go past that point and keep stitching. I'm going to count about 10 stitches or so. Lift my needle, make sure my take-up lever is all the way up, lift my presser foot, remove my work. Now you should see some twisted threads. This is from having stitched off of the machine. This is about 10 stitches, 12 stitches worth of thread. I'm going to leave these threads. I'm going to give myself a nice long tail, about 3 or 4 inches of thread. So hopefully I can zoom in here and you can see where I stitched off. There was my dart point as I had it labeled on my fabric, so I've stitched as close to that point as I could get. I don't want to stitch off up here or way down here because it changes the length of the darts, and we want to ensure that our darts are the correct length and that they are matching. And here is the thread having stitched off of the edge. It's twisted up for me, and there is the rest of my thread. I'm going to keep about 3 to 4 inches of thread at the end here. Up here where I started with my notches, I'm going to clip my threads. If there are any threads left up here, I'm just going to clip those away so we don't have to worry about those. So that is my first dart sewn, back tacked at the beginning, stitched along my stitching line along the dart leg, stitched off right there at the dart point, and continued stitching, and then lifted my work out and left some tails. I'm going to go ahead and do the second dart, again starting where the notches are, lifting my presser foot, placing that work underneath, 2 stitches forward, 2 stitches back. Be sure you're taking your back tacks in the fabric because you have notches up there. If you're sewing through the notches, they're not sewing through any fabric. So you can bypass your notch, move your fabric a little bit further into the machine, so you actually take your back tack on the actual fabric and stitch along the dart leg. Coming up to my dart point, I'm going to stitch off at that point, continue stitching for about 10 or 12 stitches. Make sure my take-up lever is up, lift my presser foot, remove my work, and leave some tails, and then clip my thread. So again, I'm leaving tails up at the top where I started. I'll snip those threads. And the next thing we'll do is head to the iron. So once you remove your work from the ironing board, or from the sewing machine, excuse me, you might notice something has happened. You can see my fabric is curving up and away from my ironing board. It's those darts that's created that 3-dimensional shape in what was otherwise a 2-dimensional piece of fabric. Now, up until now, we've been ironing flat seams, so we've been able to iron directly on the ironing board or using a tailor's board to iron flat seams. But now we're ironing a curved surface, so we need to have a curved surface to iron on top of, which introduces the next tool in the sewing studio, which is the tailor's ham, or the pressing ham. It's called a ham because it looks like a ham, scientific terminology. You can place this ham on your ironing board and then place your work on top of it. I recommend pressing your darts with the dart excess, this folded piece of fabric, facing up towards you. Avoid pressing it with the dart excess down. This would be the right side of your fabric, of your sample, where you would not see the dart excess. But if you press your work in this orientation, you run the risk of getting a ridge where this dart excess gets pressed. That dart excess can create a bit of a ridge right here. So I'm going to press it from the wrong side where the dart excess is visible. This is not something anyone would want to see on their garment. And I'm going to lay this on my tailor's ham, trying to get it on a curved surface here. Now it's important which direction I press this excess. It could go in either direction. It's not like a seam. We can't press it open. It's very much like the French seam in that it has to be pressed to one side or the other. If you look at the shape of your sample, you're going to see this shape again once we work on the skirt. This edge up here represents the waistline of the skirt. That would sit at the waist on the body. And these two curved sides on either side represent the side seams, meant to mimic the curve of the hip as it goes from the waist down into the hip. So the curved edges go on the sides of the body, This would be the center of the body, and you'd have 2 darts on either side of the center of the body. Darts are generally pressed, more often than not, darts are pressed towards the center of the body. So I'm going to press both of my darts towards the center of my sample. In some cases, with more advanced designs, you may see darts going through the side seam. In that case, your excess would be pushed towards the waistline of the body. But in this case, we're going to be pressing the dart excess towards the center of the body. So I'm going to place this on my ham, knowing this is my center. I'm going to press all of my excess in that direction. Again, I'm giving my fabric a little bit of a tug. I don't want my fabric to roll up on itself on the right side. I want it nice and clean finished on this side. So I kind of hold the fabric, tug it ever so slightly. Don't be too heavy-handed with it, but just enough to prevent it from rolling under itself. So I've got that dart pressed towards my center. I'm going to press this one towards the center as well. Again, laying my fabric on there, giving it a little bit of a tug just so it's nice and taut. Pushing my excess towards the center and pressing that in place. So that is my 3-point or plain darts sample. I'm going to go ahead and press the rest of this down here, get some of those wrinkles out, get rid of that mark that I put on there for the demo. Just trying to avoid pressing over the darts again. I don't want to affect that. So that takes care of pressing for my 3-point darts. The next thing I'll do, I'll take it back over to the workstation and finish up with these thread tails and mark my sample. So back at my work surface, my work table, I've got my dart excess. This is the wrong side of my sample again. There's my dart excess, and this is what it looks like from the right side, nice and clean, finished, and pressed. From the wrong side, I still have these little thread tails. Now when you're testing a pattern and you just need to get your darts sewn really quickly, you can leave these tails. They're not going to affect the outcome of your sample from the front. But on an actual garment, we don't want to leave these tails. No one wants to feel this against their body. And this is not the most secure method for finishing off your dart points. So what we want to do is tie some knots in these threads, and you have a few options for how to do that. You can use a sewing pin or sewing needle. You can place your pin right at your dart point. I've just pinned through my fabric here, my dart point. And then you can use this as an anchor to loop your thread around and then loop the thread tails back up through here, creating a square knot. So I've looped my threads up and around and back through the loop, creating a little square knot with both threads. And then you can utilize this to help anchor a small knot. Use your pin to anchor a small knot right there at the dart point. I'm going to remove my pin and then tighten up my knot there. That's one method. You can do that 1 or 2 times and put a tiny little knot in there. That's not my favorite method, but you can do that. I would recommend doing that at least 2 times. I'll do this one more time so you can see it. Pinning through the dart point on my sample. I'm going to take another square knot, looping the thread under my pin and back through this loop. Jesus. There we go. Got a little square knot in there. And then using my pin to anchor that knot as close to that dart point as I can. And then lifting this out. This is not my favorite method for finishing off the dart points, but it is a method. Once you've got 2 little knots in the base here, you can then clip these threads, leaving about a 1/2 inch of thread. I prefer, however, and I'll show you on this one, to take both threads, untwist them, I'm just twisting them in the opposite direction, so that I can separate both threads. Get them untwisted. And the fewer stitches you take when you stitch off, the less you'll have to untwist. But if you're working on a sample and you don't intend to put knots in the dart points, then make sure you're stitching off at least 10 or 12 stitches to keep those threads intact. Okay, I've got both threads. There's my top thread in black, my bobbin thread in white. And I'm just going to crisscross these over, again making a little square knot, just like if you were tying your shoes. Making a little square knot there, pulling that nice and tight. I can get that right down to that dart point, and I'm going to do that at least 1 or 2 more times. There's another square knot there. Pull that tight, and then maybe once more. There's my third square knot, pulling that nice and tight. I find this a little bit faster rather than having to anchor the pins and whatnot. And then again, I can trim this down to about 1/2 inch, leaving little thread tails. Let me label this sample. These are referred to as 3-point or plain darts. So you should see this lifting up and away from the table, producing some shape from the wrong side of the sample, the inside, and from the right side of the sample.